This week in wrestling history, we got another gigantic week for you here, and it starts 29 years ago this week on January 12th, 1992, on an episode of WWF Wrestling Challenge in a segment taped 1 month earlier, the same night as the Tuesday in Texas pay-per-view. Brutus the Barber Beefcake invited the Rockers onto his barber shop to iron out their differences in one of the most memorable segments in WWE history. They had some miscommunications in the months leading up to this segment, losing some of their matches. They had a miscommunication at Survivor Series, I know, that resulted in Shawn Michaels being eliminated, and he wasn't happy about that. So there was some, unfortunately, there was some issues going on in the Rockers at that time. So they came on the show here, and they were either going to work out those differences or they were going to walk off and go their separate ways. And they ended up shaking hands, and all seemed well until Shawn Michaels lowered the boom on Marty with a super kick. And then, as Bobby Heenan correctly pointed out, Jannetty tried to dive through the barbershop window to escape, like a coward. But all he ended up doing was splitting his head open. And the heel turn was complete for that Shawn Michaels guy who went on to do a few things in the business. This aired a week before the Royal Rumble. So Marty Jannetty was not going to be in the Royal Rumble anyway. This whole angle was designed to set up a match between Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty at WrestleMania 8. And that could have been a match that would still be talked about to this day had it happened. If they opened the show, imagine if they opened the show, because Shawn Michaels opened the show that night against El Matador. Tito Santana was the replacement for Marty Jannetty. And that was the match that opened WrestleMania that year. Imagine if it was Shawn Michaels one-on-one with Jannetty in their first big singles match opening WrestleMania that year at the Hoosier Dome. Could have gone down as one of the best openers in WrestleMania history, like Bret and Owen. But on January 25th, Jannetty was arrested at 2 o'clock in the morning outside the Yucatan Liquor Stand, which was a nightclub in Tampa. This is from the February 17, 1992 issue of the Wrestling Observer. Jannetty and a female companion named Angela, age 19, were trying to get into the club, and she apparently tried to use a fake ID. When police tried to arrest her, Jannetty allegedly got involved in the fray and violently grabbed the officer. Jannetty was arrested, they were both searched, and officers found less than a gram of cocaine on both of them and a twist-tied bag on Jannetty. Jannetty was arrested on possession of cocaine, possession of drug paraphernalia, and resisting arrest with force. He was then indefinitely suspended by the WWF, with the wrestlers being told that he was fired. So reports of Jannetty failing a drug test appear to be inaccurate. However, Jannetty did appear Sunday night in Japan for his SWS tour booked through the WWF. So either the suspension has already been lifted or some aspect of the suspension was a work on Jannetty and the boys. I think Jannetty has since claimed in interviews that it wasn't a fake ID issue, but they got inside just fine because they knew him there. He had been to that club before. They knew who he was, so they let him and his girl into the club. And that they knew that she was underage, which, if they knew that the girl was underage and they let her in anyway because, hey, she's with Marty, then, because Marty, I think, has also claimed that, well, he didn't know that she was not of drinking age. Well, again, if they let her in and they knew, then how did Marty not know? So there's been kind of mixed, I think, signals over the years on this story. But his version is that she started to get loud and obnoxious because she was all drunk and they were kicking her out. And so he's with her, right? He's not going to leave her by herself. So they leave. They leave the club. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. They're outside. And there was some kind of incident that took place outside the club with the cops where he said they roughed her up. And Jannetty said that he was only trying to protect her. by pulling the officer off of her, and it all just kind of went to hell after that whole thing. The point is, he got suspended. A few months later, he was fired. He was released. He never got his WrestleMania match with Shawn Michaels. In October, the company did bring him back, and we did eventually get a pay-per-view match between the two of them the following year at the Royal Rumble. And unfortunately, that match was not all that I think it could have been. 28 years ago this week, on January 11th, 1993, WWE replaced its prime-time wrestling show with a brand new show on USA Network called Monday Night Raw. Live from the Manhattan Center in New York City. Yes, Raw turned 28 years old this week. Hosted by Vince McMahon, Macho Man Randy Savage, and a comedian named Rob Bartlett, who was a fixture on Don Imus's radio show. He was terrible. He knew nothing about wrestling. He contributed absolutely nothing, let alone anything funny, to the show. And he didn't last more than a few months before they gave him the boot. But doing the show live every week, at least for those first several months it was live every week, that was a big move, because usually it was taped matches or it was, some kind of studio show or something that they did. This was really, I think, the beginning of the end of the syndicated shows. Now, the syndicated shows, Superstars and Challenge, they didn't die out right away. In fact, I think they survived into 96. Superstars, it was like 98, 99, before that show ultimately was canceled. But Superstars and Wrestling Challenge were always my go-to shows as a young fan. And all of a sudden, all of the really important matches and all the really important angles seemed to be happening on Raw every week. And I didn't even have cable until 1995. I had a relative who was taping the shows for me every week, and I would always go over to somebody else's house for the pay-per-views until 95. Then I can invite my friends to come over and watch them at home. But you could see things were changing once Raw, came on the air. Yokozuna beat Koko Beware in the opening match. Shawn Michaels beat Max Moon to retain his Intercontinental title. The Max Moon gimmick was meant for Conan, who did not last very long there. He might have actually done it for one match. They paid all this money for this very elaborate, ridiculous-looking suit. Paul Diamond got the gig because he fit into the suit. That's how he got the gig. So lucky him. They took one look at him and go, hey, he'll fit. Let's put him in the costume. So he took over from Conan. Now, Paul Diamond also happened to be former tag team partners with Shawn Michaels back in the mid-'80s in Texas All-Star Wrestling. They used to call themselves the American Breed. So there was history there between these two. And The Undertaker in the main event beat Damien Demento. So that was the very uneventful first episode of Monday Night Raw, although not quite as uneventful as a lot of Raw shows these days feel when I watch them on TV. 21 years ago this week, on January 17th, 2000, Stone Cold Steve Austin went under the knife for the most important and the riskiest surgery of his life. Would this be the end of his career? He didn't know if this was going to be it, if this was going to be the end of his run. That's the risk that was involved here. It could have ended his pro wrestling career for good. There were no guarantees heading into the surgery. He didn't know if he would ever wrestle again. But when the muscles in his left hand began to atrophy towards the end of 1999, he started thinking about his quality of life, and he knew the time had come. The stinger that he suffered when Owen Hart dropped him on his head in that match at SummerSlam back in 97, it finally caught up with him. And he always knew it would, but now he was starting to have certain, nerve issues, and, he knew that he couldn't put it off any longer. He had a large bone spur and a neck protrusion compressing his spinal cord. He had 8 millimeters of room for his spinal cord where he should have had 18 millimeters. So when you hear about like spinal stenosis, which is what Austin has, Edge has it, Sting has it. I mean, maybe there's different forms of it, but it's a narrowing of the spinal column. I mean, that's what spinal stenosis is. And so these are the issues that Austin was having. And Austin at that time, he was the golden goose. He was the biggest star in wrestling. And losing him for an extended period of time could have been a death blow for WWE. But lucky for them, they had a strong roster of performers at that time. They had The Rock as their 1B, right? Top babyface, Austin being 1A. Austin and Rock, they really were. They were 1A and 1B. And 2000 ended up being one of their best years, even without Austin. Austin missed a good chunk of that year, and it was still one of their best years creatively in the history of that company and the roster they had back then. And this is even pre-Invasion when they got some of the WCW talent and the ECW talent. The roster they had put together back then was excellent. It was an outstanding collection of talent, especially after the Radicals came in and they had Benoit and they had Saturn and they had Guerrero and Malenko. It just boosted their roster and the quality of their matches that much more. So they had written Austin off television at Survivor Series where he got run down by a car. That was to set up an angle for his eventual return. They didn't even have an end point in mind. They just did the angle and said, we'll figure it out eventually. We'll figure it out as we go, who the culprit was. We'll figure it out later on when we have to, but let's just shoot the angle and get this guy off TV. Days before the surgery was supposed to happen, Austin pulled a swerve by changing doctors, which caused a bit of controversy at that time. He had chosen Dr. Henry Ballman, who invented the surgery that Austin needed. So look, if you're going to have somebody do the surgery, you can't get any better than going with the guy who invented the operation himself. I would say that guy probably knows what he's doing. And so he was the one who was supposed to perform the surgery, but then about a week before, he switched to Dr. Lloyd Youngblood out of San Antonio, Texas, in part because he lived a lot closer to Youngblood. And so in Austin's mind, he felt that if I'm going to have all these follow-up appointments, or God forbid if something goes wrong and I have to get back to the doctor quickly, it made him feel more comfortable knowing that he was, physically, geographically, he was a lot closer to Youngblood than he would have been to the other doctor. And so that was one of the reasons why he made the switch. Now, the Associated Press at that time ran a story about Austin changing doctors. This was big news, apparently. This is how big of a star Austin was and how popular wrestling was. He was the biggest star in the business, so him changing doctors ahead of surgery was apparently national news. AP did a story, and they interviewed the original doctor, Dr. Ballman, who did not sound very happy about the change. He said, this is about Austin now, he said, he went to see 2 neurosurgeons in San Antonio who fed him a bunch of propaganda. It's pathetic. This is what the doctor said. He goes, it's pathetic. You would think that he would be astute enough to come to somebody who pioneered this, who has done this for years. Now, I get the sense that Dr. Ballman did not exactly approve of Austin's decision, but look, it is his decision, right? He's the patient, and the patient is going to make the decision that he feels he needs to make for himself. And I think to question the patient publicly like that just comes off to me as very tacky. Days after the surgery, which went well, Austin was already running on a treadmill. He was told it would be 6 months before he could be back in the ring, and he was hoping to come back in 3 because he's a wrestler, and that's what wrestlers do. Whatever the doctor says, just cut that number in half, and then they try to work towards that goal. It took 9. It took 9 months before Austin got cleared, and he was back in the ring for that match against Rikishi. Youngblood did neck surgeries for a lot of other wrestlers, a lot of other WWE stars. It is kind of weird how all of these neck and spinal fusion surgeries happen all around the same time, right? After the proliferation of all the ladder matches and the TLC matches, all of a sudden everybody was breaking their neck and all of a sudden needed spinal fusion surgery. So he did the surgery for Chris Benoit. He did the surgery for Lita, although she actually broke her neck on the set of a TV show, right? I think that was the Dark Angel show. She did some kind of stunt and broke her neck on the show. Rhino, Bob Holly, Test, there might have been a few others. That's a lot of broken necks. And he became the go-to doctor for it. 20 years ago this week, on January 11th, 2001, following months of rumors and negotiations, Eric Bischoff and his business partners at Fusient Media Ventures hosted a 45-minute conference call to announce their intent to buy World Championship Wrestling from Time Warner. After a tumultuous few years, WCW, by this point, was far removed from its glory days, but there was excitement all of a sudden about the potential future of WCW. Ken Bischoff, who was the one in charge when WCW had its greatest success, and now he's got the financial backing behind him. He won't be handcuffed anymore by Turner and standards and practices or working with Vince Russo or any of this other stuff. And there was a certain level of excitement about what the future might hold for a possible WCW turnaround or a WCW relaunch. Variety at that time even reported that Fusient had plans to meet with WWE with the hope of creating some interpromotional pay-per-view events. Now, would that have actually happened? No. But they were at least open to the idea. They were hopeful that Vince McMahon might be receptive to having conversations with them. But something else happened on January 11th, 2001, only a few hours after that conference call ended, that would ultimately prove fatal to the deal. That very same day, the sale of Time Warner to AOL, which had been announced 1 year earlier. It was February of 2000 when the deal was first announced. But then you go through all of the due diligence and everything. It takes a while sometimes for these deals to close. And it just so happened that very same day, a few hours later, the deal was done. The deal officially closed. It went through. The infamous AOL Time Warner merger. And when that happened, everything, including all of the WCW losses, would be scrutinized with a fine-tooth comb. They're going to go through the books. They're going to crunch the numbers. And while they were reviewing all of their assets, Fusient, meanwhile, who was buying WCW, they took the time to do the same thing. The belief is that WCW lost somewhere between $60 and $80 million in the year 2000 alone. This year is the 20th anniversary of the death of WCW. So I'm going to be talking a lot about it in far greater detail when we get to March. I'm going to save it for March. And how things fell apart, why they fell apart. But Bischoff's plan was for the company to shut down and then relaunch on May 6th with a pay-per-view called The Big Bang. There was even an advertisement for it on the back cover of the WCW magazine, I think the second to last issue of the WCW magazine. Fusient originally agreed to a sale price of $70 million, but after they got a look at the company's financial books for January, they lowered that down to $50 million. But once that merger closed in January with AOL Time Warner, they didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of the end for WCW. 3 days later, WCW hosted its first and what would be its last Sin pay-per-view. WCW's Sin, which is notable for a couple of things. It's notable for featuring Bill Goldberg's final WCW match where he teamed with, of all people, Dwayne Bruce, Sergeant Buddy Lee Parker, who helped run the WCW power plant. I heard a lot of not so nice things about Sarge and the way he did things, but he ran the WCW power plant. That's where Goldberg was trained. So this was his trainer. I don't know what the storyline purpose was for them coming together, but this is the man who trained him. They lost to Lex Luger and Buff Bagwell in a match where if Goldberg lost, he would be forced to leave WCW, which turned out to be a shoot, right? Little did they all know, he really did leave WCW. Serves him right for teaming with Buddy Lee Parker. I could probably count on one hand the number of matches that Buddy Lee Parker won on television in his entire career. I don't think I would have put my career on the line in a match with him as my partner, but that's me. Before the finish, Goldberg was maced by a planted fan in the front row. This poor bastard. First, he gets his streak ended by being tasered. He gets tased, and then loses his championship, and his streak is broken. Then he has his career ended by being maced. But in reality, Goldberg needed some time off for shoulder surgery, hence why the stipulation was added. But mostly, this pay-per-view is notable for one of the most gruesome injuries in wrestling history. And I would argue, in my opinion, of all the injuries that I've seen, the most gruesome injury that I've seen. And I saw the footage on social media recently of that one independent wrestler who just jumped off the middle rope on the inside and snapped both of his legs. That probably was worse, because now you're talking about two legs instead of one. Actually, not only that, but from what I understand, I haven't heard any update on that guy. And there was a GoFundMe for him, and there was talk that he might lose both of his legs, and his life potentially was in jeopardy. So that was, a pretty serious, disgusting situation. But in terms of, big injuries in the major promotions, I've never seen one before or after as horrific as the one that took place on this pay-per-view. Main event was Scott Steiner, Sid Vicious, Jeff Jarrett, and a mystery fourth man who turned out to be Road Warrior Animal for the WCW World title. He did not even show up. Animal did not even show up until the very end of the match to reveal himself. He was wearing this just ridiculous-looking costume. And he wasn't even the first choice. It was originally going to be Scott's brother Rick. It was going to be Rick Steiner as the mystery fourth guy. The belief was that the fans already knew. They kind of figured out that it was going to be Rick Steiner, and so they changed it to swerve everybody because they didn't want people to know. That's like Vince McMahon getting angry that the internet figured out that Christian was coming back and that he was going to, attack Jeff Hardy at the Royal Rumble in 2009 and cost him the WWE title. And so he changed it to Matt Hardy instead. And we got a Matt Hardy and a Jeff Hardy feud, which I don't think anybody ever wanted to see. The first time they did that, it didn't work. And it didn't work the second time either. But that was a rash decision. It was a reactionary thing because he got very upset when people figured out it was going to be Christian, and instead they sent Christian to their lame excuse for ECW. But anyway, John Laurinaitis was working behind the scenes for WCW at that time, probably talent relations, and he wanted Sid to come off the second rope with a big boot to Scott Steiner. Sid, rightfully, had reservations about doing it because he didn't do moves off the ropes. How often do you remember Psycho Sid going to the middle rope, going to the top rope? I'm not saying it never ever happened, but if it did, it was rare. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. The guy is 6'9", 320 pounds. He doesn't have to do fucking moves off the ropes. And he knew that it probably wasn't going to end well. He says Johnny Ace insisted that he do it because it's already in the script. And that would be, the plan was when he hit the move, the production crew knew that was the point that they would cut backstage to a shot of the mystery fourth guy arriving. So they had already worked all of this into into the script, into the plan for what was supposed to take place that night. Apparently, if they changed that one move in the script, I guess the whole thing would have fallen apart. The earth would have fallen off of its rotation if they just took that one move out of the script, according to John Laurinaitis. So Sid, against his better judgment, he's not too bright for agreeing to this either, by the way. He bears some of the responsibility for this too, because he could have said, no, fuck you, I'm not doing it. You want to fire me, go ahead. I'll sue you. So against his better judgment, he did it anyway. And he did it. He did what he was told to do. The company, he knew the company had new owners, and this was part of it too. And I get this. The company had new owners. They had already had that big announcement a few weeks earlier. Not a few weeks, 4 days, right? 3 or 4 days earlier is when they had the conference call, and Eric Bischoff and Fusient were coming in, and everybody thought it was a done deal, even though it wasn't. But now we have new owners coming in, and so part of it was, okay, look, I got to show that I can be a team player. I don't want to cause problems. I don't want to become a headache for them. Oh, Sid, he doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to be a team player. Right? So he did it. And what he got for being a team player was a compound fracture when his leg snapped in half upon landing on the mat. He snapped his tibia. He snapped his fibia. The bone actually broke through the skin. Now, thankfully, that part we couldn't see because of his boot. But just the sight of the boot dangling, I get shivers every time just thinking about it. You know, my father used to talk about the Joe Theismann injury in the Giants game many years ago back in the 80s. I was too young to remember that. That Sid injury, that's my Joe Theismann moment. And I wish I never saw it. And none of us would have seen it. The fans at home would have been spared from even seeing the injury were it not for Eric Bischoff the next night on Nitro making the decision that they were going to air it on TV. He was the one who made the call to air the replay on Nitro the next night, and the reason they did that is because they cut away live on the pay-per-view to show the Mystery Men, so live, people didn't see the injury. People in the building didn't see the injury. If I remember, people literally turned their heads. Everybody in the first 5 rows, no one is watching what happened. Maybe one guy was, but everybody turned their head to look down the aisle or look at the screens. Even the people in the building didn't see what happened, and the people at home didn't see what happened because the camera cut to a different angle. We didn't see Sid come off the top and snap his leg. That footage wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be floating around on the internet were it not for Bischoff making the call the next night. We're going to show the whole thing in full. And that's why the footage is even out there in the first place. I don't even think the announcers saw it because they were just confused when they looked back. They saw, Sid is just kind of laying on the mat. He's kind of holding his leg. He's clutching his leg. So my guess is what they were doing is they were watching their monitors, which is what you're trained to do as an announcer. You call what the people at home are seeing. You don't call what you're seeing at ringside. That's why their heads were always buried in their monitors. And you think, well, why are they watching on TV? They have the best seat in the house, these guys. They're sitting right there. They should be looking up at what's going on. Yeah, they'll pick their head up every now and then to see what's going on. But 90% of the time, their head is buried in the monitor because you have to call what the people at home are seeing. So there was just mass confusion. I remember the referee was freaked out. He didn't know what to do. Steiner didn't know Sid was hurt. He starts kicking Sid. Thankfully, he didn't kick him in the leg. It was horrifying to watch him laying there, and nobody rushed out to help. There was no other referees came out. There's no doctors or trainers or anybody. And maybe they just didn't know. But the guy is just laying there. His leg is snapped in half, and he probably was laying there for what felt like forever. And there's guys coming over and kicking him because they have no idea that he's hurt. So he had a 2-hour surgery that night, had a 17-inch rod inserted in his leg to hold it in place. And that was the end, really, of his full-time career. That was pretty much it. He did manage to come back. He did wrestle again. But that was after years of rehab. Sid ended up suing WCW for lost wages and damages, or he sued the remnants of, I guess, WCW, since they went out of business a couple of months later. As I recall, the court, I think, ruled against him, and the decision was upheld on appeal, so I don't know that he ever really got anything out of it. But that was the story of Sid and his unfortunate injury at Sin. This is a big year, 2001. There's going to be a lot of 20-year anniversaries coming up in these history segments over the next several months. So get ready. 15 years ago this week, on January 15th, 2006, at TNA's Final Resolution pay-per-view, AJ Styles defeated New Japan Pro Wrestling's Hiroshi Tanahashi. Doing so after Shannon Moore ran in and hit Tanahashi in the head by accident with a plaque, which led to a Styles clash for the win. Tanahashi was a star on the rise by this point. 6 months later, he would win his first of 8 IWGP heavyweight titles. This show also featured the TNA return of Sting, which most people consider to be his formal debut, if you forget about the couple of appearances he made a few years before. This was really what kicked off his full-time run in TNA, tagging with Christian Cage in a win over Jeff Jarrett and the alpha male, Monty Brown. 11 years ago this week, on January 17th, 2010, TNA held its Genesis pay-per-view, the first pay-per-view of the Hulk Hogan-Eric Bischoff regime. They came to the ring to open the show, were greeted by chants of "We want 6 sides," to which Hogan replied, "You had it, and it only got you so far." Or as Hogan said it, "Gut you. It only got you so far." Anytime Hulk Hogan tries to say the word "got," I've noticed this over the years. Anytime he tries to say the word "got," he can't do it. He says it like "gut." Like, if he ever bought his kids a puppy for Christmas, I can just imagine the looks on their little faces when he comes to them and says, "I got you a puppy." And then they burst into tears. "You monster." Has a very different meaning when you say it like that. But one of the first things they did when Hogan and Bischoff came into WCW was they got rid of the 6-sided ring. That really was, TNA had been using it for years. It had become part of their identity. It kind of separated them and the look of the product from WWE. I was never a big fan of the 6 sides myself, but I can understand, in their mind, it's what separates us from them, right? It became part of their brand identity. And it pissed off all of the diehards in Orlando. They wanted 6 sides back. And Hogan, who was not out there to be a heel, but you would never know that the way he was being booed, said, "We're not going to have any 6 sides, 8 sides, or playpen rings. This is where men wrestle." He said he was proud to be part of a wrestling company and not sports entertainment like their competitor, where you can't even mention the word wrestling in their locker room. And he ended with, "What you gonna do, Vince McMahon? Now that TNA is coming for you, brother or sister." I always thought that was weird. That last little part there, that was always very weird. It's like he forgot Vince McMahon's gender there for a second. Said brother, but then he said or sister. It could go either way. But if that doesn't sum up the Hogan-Bischoff era of Impact, then I don't know what does. Fucking guy, he robbed those people blind, and then he went right back to sports entertainment, right? Didn't take very long for that to happen. Took 4 years. That's not really that long. He got what he wanted to get out of it, and he got out of town. 4 years later, Impact, once Hogan was gone, Impact reverted back to the 6-sided ring. And then 4 years after that, they went back to the traditional 4 sides, which they still use to this day. Brother or sister. 7 years ago this week, on January 13th, 2014, just 2 weeks after joining the Wyatt family, Daniel Bryan left the group in one of the greatest closing scenes in the history of Monday Night Raw. 2 weeks earlier, Bryan battled each member of the Wyatts in a gauntlet match. First, he beat Luke Harper, then he beat Eric Rowan, and then he beat Bray Wyatt by DQ when Harper and Rowan got involved and they attacked him, they laid him out. After the match, Bryan, who had been fighting the good fight for months against the Authority after being screwed out of the WWE title at SummerSlam, but he just kept getting beaten down and beaten down and beaten down. And now here he was being beaten down by the Wyatts. Well, Bryan had had enough. And he told Bray, "You're right. The machine will never let me win." And he allowed Bray to hit him with Sister Abigail as his initiation, I guess you would say, into the group. This was, at the time, a questionable move. And I remember talking about this on the podcast. This is a very questionable move, turning him heel. or aligning him with a heel faction at a time when he was a white-hot babyface. I mean, Bryan was, and he hadn't even hit his peak yet, but he was the hottest babyface in that company, and it was all organic. It was not something I think that the company ever expected. Now, once they saw it starting to happen, they kind of nurtured it and they went with it, but people just took to this guy. They liked him. They liked how scrappy he was. He was this great underdog. It didn't hurt that he was a great wrestler. He would go out there and have great matches. They just sort of latched onto him. And now you're taking this guy after he's already been screwed over, plenty of times, and now he's joining a heel faction. It just didn't feel like a very smart move. We didn't know how long this was going to go on for. But the turn didn't last long. 2 weeks later on Raw, Bryan and Bray had a steel cage match against the Usos that they lost after Bryan was knocked off the cage and accidentally crotched Bray on the ropes. That allowed Jimmy and Jay to escape for the win, and that set the stage for one of my all-time favorite Raw moments. I would put this moment and the crowd reaction to this moment in the same category with some of the best moments of the Attitude Era. It was that good. And I had not heard a crowd response like this to a wrestler on that show since the days of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, I'm not saying that Daniel Bryan was as big as Stone Cold Steve Austin, okay? I'm not saying that. Do not twist my words. That is not what I am saying. I'm talking about the crowd support that night. And the crowd support that he was getting week after week after week heading into WrestleMania. The crowd support for this guy, this 5'8" guy, not the biggest guy on the roster, came the closest to anyone that I had seen since the original Austin run. That includes John Cena, that includes CM Punk, and any other babyface you want to throw in there who got great reactions, but nothing like this. There was just something different about this. There was something different about the way the fans took to this guy and those yes chants, and the way they would just chant it in unison, and they would stand with him. It was cool to see. It was very cool to see that the fans cared that much about somebody. It had been so long since they just took to somebody like that it just made for some of these really fun moments, and this was maybe the biggest one, frankly, on this show. Bray was angry, and it looked like Bryan was just going to submit to him again and just let him go ahead and hit Sister Abigail. But instead, he shoved him away. And the crowd grew loud. They knew what was coming. They badly wanted to see it. They were hoping that this was it. This was the night that he would finally break free of the Wyatt family, break free of their spell. I would like to think that this was all done by design and was part of Bryan's master plan to get Bray trapped in the cage all by himself with Harper and Rowan outside. The door is locked. They can't get in. They try to climb. He knocks them off. I don't think that that's how they portrayed it on TV, that this was kind of this was premeditated. I mean, maybe they did. I don't remember them really playing it off that way. But Bray comes charging in at him, and Bryan ducks, and he starts wailing away on Bray Wyatt. And the crowd comes alive. And then came the drop kicks in the corner. These rapid-fire drop kicks, one after the other. Bray just comes crumbling in a heap out of the corner. Then the yes kicks. These people are losing their frickin' minds in this building. Then come the yes kicks. They're all chanting along with each one. Harper and Rowan, they're trying to climb in. Bryan keeps knocking him down. Bray is trapped all alone by himself. And then Bryan stands in the corner, and he very slowly begins to point his fingers up into the air. And the crowd begins the yes chants, but they do it only when Bryan puts his fingers in the air. In between each one, you could hear a pin drop in that building. It is stone cold silent. But then they get faster and faster and faster, and louder and louder and louder, until Bryan finally hits the running knee, and then he climbs to the top of the cage, and he sits there on his perch, and the crowd joins in in unison with yes chants. The scary part is that Bryan was concussed during that match and has no memory of any of this. He doesn't have memory of the match. He doesn't have memory of any of the post-match stuff. So one of the most memorable moments of this guy's career, the kind of reaction that I would think as a performer you would kill for, and he doesn't remember any of it. It's like Undertaker, right? Maybe the single most talked about moment of this man's career is the end of the streak at WrestleMania 30, and he has no memory of it. He remembers being in the dressing room a few hours before the pay-per-view, and his memory doesn't pick up again until the middle of the night when he's laying in a hospital bed. But yet, you look at these guys when they're out there, and Bryan had to climb a cage. Think about that. Their body and their brains, it's like they just know what to do. They're just running on autopilot. Concussions are scary. And finally, 1 year ago this week. Has it really been a year? I guess it has. On January 11th, 2020, the day before her match with Sami Callihan at Impact Wrestling's Hard to Kill pay-per-view, where she would go on to become the first woman ever to hold the Impact World Championship, Tessa Blanchard was not very happy with the lack of support that she was getting from her fellow women's wrestlers online, who were radio silent about her big match coming up. So she posted a tweet, and in 9 simple words, she opened up the floodgates. She opened up a huge can of worms. She said, "Hey women, try supporting one another. Cool things happen." Well, a lot of her colleagues, they took her advice. They did. They did show their support for one another, just not in the way that Tessa Blanchard had hoped. The first person to respond was Chelsea Green, who said, "You have consistently put down, bullied, and belittled countless female co-workers, including me. Is that support?" Allison Kay, Sienna, then responded, "Remember when you spat in a black woman's face and called her the N-word in Japan? Was that you supporting women?" The audacity of this tweet. Priscilla Kelly chimed in, "Remember publicly putting me down on Twitter last year for something that didn't involve you whatsoever, then continuing to drag my name to other people for it? Pepperidge Farm remembers. You should probably delete this tweet." Rebel, who we just saw on Dynamite this week with Britt Baker, said, "I like to think that people change over time, but I can confirm that the bad behavior and non-supportive attitude in Japan happened. I was there." Isla Dawn from NXT UK. "As someone who experienced your bullying firsthand, received regular verbal abuse, was spat on, had rumors spread about me, dealt with multiple attempts by you to blacklist me from other companies, plus more, I just pray now that you follow your own advice." This went from 0 to 60 real quick. The wrestler in question that Tessa allegedly said that to also chimed in, and she acknowledged that it did happen. Now, Tessa, for her part, denied ever using the racial slur. She said that that word is not even in her vocabulary. It would never even leave her mouth. It would never enter her mind. It's one thing to have, one person say something like that, and then you come out and deny it. But when you have wrestler and this is not just random people or fans, these are wrestlers. These are other people in the business, fellow colleagues of hers, some of whom have a lot of friends and they're very well respected and have no reason to lie. Right, we're not talking about 1 or 2 people. When person after person, wrestler after wrestler after wrestler comes out with all of these accusations, and there were a lot of people at the time who said, boy, this sounds real fishy. It's the day before her big match, the biggest match of her life. All these people are suddenly piling on. Yeah, well, the reason they're piling on is because she set the bait. They took she got them hook, line, and sinker. It's like putting a trap out for a mouse with some peanut butter and they all come running to it. She's the one who set the bait in the first place. If she wouldn't have said anything, then this wouldn't have happened. I'm sure these people wouldn't have exactly voiced their support, but nobody would have said a word. So it's kind of hard to have any sympathy. It's not a case where they had this premeditated plan where 24 hours before her big pay-per-view match, I know, let's all get on some like private WhatsApp conversation. Let's get every woman on a WhatsApp conversation and we'll organize and we'll orchestrate this. And we'll time it for the day before. She posted the tweet. She set the bait down and people took it. You can understand why these people would think it was very hypocritical of her to say something like that. All she had to do was say nothing or just leave out the part about calling out all women. All because she wasn't getting the accolades and the congratulations online that anybody else in her spot absolutely would have been getting. If that was almost anybody else in the wrestling business, if it was Charlotte Flair or Sasha Banks or Becky Lynch or Deonna Purrazzo going for the first male championship in a major promotion, I'm sure there would have been tons of tweets of support, assuming that they were well liked. The fact that that didn't happen, I think, spoke volumes, and she caused her own self-destruction with one tweet. Now, she did go on to win the Impact World title. Then the pandemic hit, and she ended up being stripped of it in the summer before being released from her contract. I think her contract was about to expire anyway. And she has not been seen since. Not in any major promotion. She has not been seen or heard from since. What does the future hold for Tessa Blanchard? I do believe that she will end up in WWE or AEW. Remember, she's only 25 years old. She's still very young. She's very good in the ring. I don't think anybody is denying the fact that she has talent. She's very good and she's very young. If she were to go to AEW, she would immediately vault to the top of their women's division. But in WWE, she would have, I think, more to work with. So I'm sticking to the prediction I made a long time ago of a WrestleMania main event with her and Charlotte Flair in the next 5 years. The Daughters of the Horsemen. I just think it's too much for Vince McMahon to resist. But let this be yet another in a long line of examples of how Twitter can derail one's career. And that is this week in wrestling history.